Hey, good morning, everybody. Mike Shea, your Florida business broker with Transworld Business Advisors. I got Lisa Kahn back again. Just got off her cruise and finished up the holidays. And the reason we got her back on again is we haven't done a visa status update with regard to what we're seeing in the embassies. So I wanted to get on the topic of timelines. Any new COVID related data that she's got insight on, speed at the embassies. And then we were just chatting before we started recording about the influx of Canadians. And the reality is that we're probably doing change of status on some of those folks that are, bundling them across the border. So Lisa, I'll let you go. So let's start with what's the updates on the various countries we primarily deal with in terms of timelines and COVID restrictions, et cetera.
Okay, well, I think things are better. Things are better than they were, say, a year ago. And I think part of it is maybe the government and everybody learning how to live in this new reality. And so that's a positive. I think things are not where we were when COVID first hit and everything just shut down and the embassies weren't doing any interviews and nothing was happening and nobody knew when this was going to end. And so I feel like the embassies are getting into a little bit of a groove, at least when it comes to E2s. Most embassies are still not issuing visitor visas at all. And so they're still, quite limited in what they're doing. Same thing on the immigrant visa front. But on the E2 front, they're still accepting them, and they always have. And I think the processing times have gotten better. With regard to London, where you and I have a lot of filings, they're pretty quick right now. I think in the review time, we're seeing, back to the days of maybe a month or so to actually review an application. But the trickier thing now is getting an appointment. It used to be that you'd get a response from the embassy that we've reviewed your application. Now we'll invite you for an interview and you could get an interview in a couple of weeks, perhaps. Now it's more like 3 months forward that you can get an interview. They do have, once we've got an interview, though, we can kind of keep going back into the system and checking to see if there's any new dates that have become available and reschedule those interviews and bring them up a little bit. And we've had pretty good success with that. And I think in part because some people have canceled their interview, they don't want to travel, some deals fall through, this, that, and the other. So
let's recap that. So I think the last time we talked, we were looking 4 or 5 months. And now,
and I'd say that's still, to be honest, pretty realistic from start to finish, because it is taking a little longer to get an interview. If you kind of look at the scheduling system right now, there's really nothing showing before probably April. So I would say that's still pretty realistic time. The embassy's not sitting on the cases as long, so they're going through them more quickly, but it's a matter of getting that appointment date, and they're not coming as fast. So I'd still say 3 to 4 months is realistic, with the possibility perhaps of sometimes bringing that a little closer if we keep an eye on the interview schedule. Every now and again, a date will pop up. Just, it might show something like there's one date in February and then nothing until April. So if someone is fairly flexible and can grab maybe that earlier date, we're in some cases able to do that.
Okay. And then you had mentioned that on the renewals, and maybe this applies to the change of status when people eventually go back for the full processing, the requirements of these countries that you have your vaccination, right? So
that's an interesting thing now too. Previously we had talked about for E2s, there were the travel bans, travel restrictions, those have been lifted as they had been implemented before, where E2 visa holders needed a national interest exception. That's kind of done. We don't need the national interest exception anymore. But all non-immigrants, whether they're on an E2 or another non-immigrant visa, must have proof that they're fully COVID vaccinated. So if people don't want to have the vaccine or haven't had it, that's going to be a problem for them. They could get the visa, but they're not getting over unless they're fully vaccinated. Right. There's a few exceptions to that, but they're really limited. The best resource, honestly, is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website, just cdc.gov. You can go to that and say, I'm a non-immigrant, click, what are the requirements to come to the US? And it'll go through exactly what you need to have as far as what types of vaccination, what form of vaccination can you present. The exceptions really are for children under 18. They don't have to show the vaccination. diplomats, people with medical contraindications,
Diplomat.
armed forces, some stuff like that. Things that we don't really see a heck of a lot other than maybe children under 18.
Yeah.
So if you've got somebody that is just sort of opposed morally maybe to the vaccine or doesn't really want it because they don't know what it is, they're not really going to be able to get around it very easily. There's also some requirements in addition to the vaccine to have a negative COVID test, I think within at least a day prior to boarding your flight. Those things are a little fluid. So I would suggest to anybody now that, that they make sure that they're just checking the most recent updates, because sometimes they'll say you need to have, and I get them all confused, a viral test, an antigen test, 1 day forward. Now it's 4 days before. That kind of thing can change, but it's going to be the same requirements if you're coming in from Canada, if you're coming in from the UK or coming in from Mexico. So that CDC guideline and that website is a really good resource for just making sure that people, that are getting the visa can, know what to do about coming back in. One thing that's interesting for people that are in the US already on, let's say, an E2 visa, I've had a few folks on a visa that haven't been vaccinated in the US, but are here and have a valid visa with maybe several years remaining. If they're going to go back home to visit family or, they've got business interests, they're not going to get back in on that visa unless and until they meet the vaccination requirements as well. Oops, so sorry. Look at that.
The other thing we had talked about was the influx over the last 90 days of Canadians.
Yeah. So this is interesting. I think, Canada has taken COVID more seriously than Florida, for example, with a lot of lockdowns. And I was talking to someone yesterday who said you can't even have more than 5 people in your own home. So the restrictions are definitely different than what we're seeing here. And there are some people that have said, I can't live like this. I can't run my business like this. We can't do this anymore. And sometimes it's, maybe a mental struggle where they just can't keep living like this. And sometimes it's financial and other variables. But I have definitely seen a lot more Canadians, and I think you have too, who've said, we're done. And we're coming to Florida or we're coming to the US and we want to buy a business, start a business and make that move.
Right.
Toronto, was really tough when COVID first hit because they were not doing any interviews, or when the interviews we were getting scheduled were for like 9 to 12 months forward from when we would submit, which is impractical. Soonest I've been getting an appointment now out of Toronto is about 3 months after submission. But again, with the spikes in COVID and rumors that Canada is starting to go back into another lockdown, that might affect, again, the E2 processing times.
Right, because the embassies flow with what the local government does. And
right, exactly. So the option for some then is to come from Canada as a visitor. And if you're in the US as a visitor, and many people come as a visitor to, meet with folks like you or me to kind of scout out the possibility of investing here, looking at business opportunities. If someone is here pursuant to a valid visitor admission, not under the ESTA, but a B1, B2 visitor visa, or for Canadians, they often come in and are granted a 6-month stay. If they find a business and they're here, there is the possibility to file with immigration an E2 petition and a change of status. So immigration can approve the E2 filing and change the status over from a visitor to an E2, good for 2 years.
Right.
The change of status can be done pretty quickly. The applicant can pay a premium processing fee of $2,500 for a 2-week turnaround time. So that's great when a seller wants to close on the business, and when somebody says, I want to get this deal done, I want to be able to start working in the business, run the business, close on it, etc. The downside to the change of status is it's only valid as long as someone remains in the US. So if they're switched over from a visitor to an E2 for 2 years, they can run the business and be here for 2 years. But let's say 4 or 5 months into being here, there's an emergency back home in Canada, family member's ill, and they jump on a plane and go back. That's the end of the change of status. They can't take that paper with them and then get back in on it. The only way to get back in as an E2 is with the actual visa, and only the US Embassy can issue a visa.
Right.
So that's the downside of the change of status. And I always try to make sure that people understand that when they do it. We've also had some people who said, I get that, but I can't wait however many months it's going to be to get the visa. Let's do the change of status, close on this business, get rolling. And at the same time, let's go ahead and submit our visa to the embassy in Toronto so it's there. And if we get an appointment in 4 months, or it ends up being 6 or 7 or 8, so be it. At least, we've got the business, we're here, we're running it, and we know that we might be, a little bit stuck until we get the visa, but they'll do that subsequently.
Yeah. So the one other thing I wanted to, because we got a lot of people who watch because you're on here talking about visas, is this, buyers immigrating, it's not just finding the business and doing the visa. That's relatively simple for us. The new dynamic of everybody coming to Florida, not just, Europeans that have always come, but now we've got people from all the blue states.
Yeah.
The same reaction we're hearing from Canada, I'm hearing from New York, Michigan,
Sure.
Pennsylvania, New Jersey. They're like, we're done. And now I've got people who are like, we've got housing shortage driven by COVID. We've got, spikes in prices. So, you and I have been doing this long enough where the average visa holder 10, 15 years ago was coming over under $300,000 in liquidity, maybe $100,000 in liquidity. And we're still able to get up and running, buy a home, get a rental property, and kind of stabilize. Now we're facing this added issue of, how do I get them in the house? Where are they going to live? And it's forcing people. I'm having conversations now where I'm saying, look, the visas, I mean, I don't mean to downplay it, but it's kind of mechanical at this point for us. We know what we got to do. We have these conversations, we process it. But now you got to plan cash flow reserves, the housing component at a much higher degree. And it's forcing people to look at different markets that they didn't have to look. I mean, like the average house in Orlando is doubled. And how do you do that when you don't have a credit rating? So we've talked about the importance of cash flow as a new business owner. Someday this will, as we kind of catch our breath and COVID stabilizes, we'll not have that issue anymore. But I wanted to get that, knowing that people watch your stuff, is like, hey, the housing issue is a major issue now. That's going to cost you more money. So you either look for a tighter market, and you say, hey, outside the metroplex of Orlando. So if you're looking at, West Polk County, out past Davenport, where, all the Brits kind of congregated, go west, young man type of conversation is happening. And then DeLand, Volusia County, even to the coast over into Brevard, where housing is always, it's still hot market, but not as hot as the metroplex.
I think that's a really good point. I think people need to be open-minded and realistic to the reality today. I would assume too, and you probably have a better handle on this than me, that the demand being higher and people coming from out of state that are also looking to buy businesses is driving the prices of the businesses up. Slightly.
We still have a shortage. We still have a shortage of inventory. The challenge for the expat is the quality of the records. So the American, coming from New York, who's accustomed to some shady stuff on financials, probably doesn't have the intense scrutiny. If you're in the country, the fixation on quality of books and records and the clean tax returns and all the stuff that you worry about what the embassy is going to say. Look, it's supply and demand. That's always been a tight market. So if we looked at Orlando, I always run this exercise. If there's 600 businesses for Orlando, it's statistically year after year, less than 20% will qualify for the visa.
Yeah.
Okay, what's our price? And then the number gets tighter and tighter and tighter. So hey, here's 5.
Sure.
So I had a couple the other night, and I'm like, we're going to go through this dance of wanting to look as many businesses as possible, but I already know what the one is, because the visa is this massive filter that has these documentation requirements that just says, here's your choices. That's what's driving the numbers up. Now, if you move to other markets, there's less competition, and that's going to eventually, it's just, you have this dream of Mickey Mouse. Hey, you're not living at Mickey Mouse. You're going to go live in Melbourne, or you're going to go live at Cocoa Beach, which, terrible to live on the coast. Or you're moving to Lakeland. And I think what you're going to see, I'm starting to see people, I've had 3 Canadians go to Texas and Oklahoma.
I had some folks yesterday who actually, I think, bought a home in Florida, but were open to the idea of another state if they can't find a business here.
Yeah, and I've had referrals from Canadian. The Canadian dynamic has forced people to go. They're looking at the housing component, although they got a lot of liquidity. And I'm literally in good service saying, you need to look elsewhere. This is in Dallas and Houston and Oklahoma City. I sent somebody to Tulsa. I had a Canadian go buy a property, a business in Tulsa.
How does it work for you, Mike? Or do you have access to the listings out of state as well? Or
so if they're looking
to other affiliates?
there are franchise partners. So inside of our T World, so when they look at my website, they're looking at traditionally the MLS.
Hmm.
Then I have the Transworld site. And then in the Transworld site, they can look at everything we have in our London office. They can look in Australia. They can look in New Zealand, Dubai, Canada.
Gotcha.
Unfortunately, it's like the dynamic is those markets haven't dealt with immigration.
Right.
So the brokers are kind of going, all right, Mike. And that's where you kind of,
Right.
because of hell, I said, just call Lisa. And so what you're getting these phone calls from like Minneapolis and
Right, and it has been, South Carolina or
Right.
here, there, and other places. The interesting thing, and it might be helpful for people that are listening as well, because immigration is federal law and not state law. I can represent E2 visa clients, whether they're in Florida or they're in Texas or they're in New York, and I have clients all around. So
Right.
sometimes I think people might think, oh gosh, we found a business in Texas. Now we have to start with another immigration attorney in Texas, and it's not necessary.
Right, right. And federal law is federal law is federal law. And I would encourage them, given this housing dynamic, I'm having some conversations going, you should look at South Carolina, you should look at Georgia, you should look at Texas, and it's such a massive country, it's kind of blows their mind.
Right.
What they know is Florida.
Sure.
And over that emotional, I'm like, look, there's some really beautiful and great places to live in the United States that aren't seeing this dynamic where the opportunity may be greater. And so it's opening some eyes. I mean, the Canadians looking out west is a unique phenomenon. I've had people ask before about, California. It's always the coasts. But I'm like,
right.
You're going to see, the Carolinas and Georgia represent some good opportunities, and maybe the Midwest again, and no one wants the snow, but Tennessee, and we fortunately have the ability to service all those guys. So,
okay, good to know.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it. Anything else on the visa front?
I think it's on the talking about like the change of status. I feel like immigration is in a pretty good place here. The nature of the adjudications. I feel like we're in a good spot as far as filings go here, reasonable adjudications, and really the same thing at the embassies too. So sometimes people ask about trends in adjudications and are things getting more difficult as far as the decision making, and no, I think the decisions are fair, and we haven't had any problems coming out of there. It's really just this dance of the timing and the COVID issues that's making things more challenging.
Yeah, I haven't seen any crazy, like if you follow the steps, you dot the I's, you cross the T's, you screen the business, you put your packet together, the flow of the money, the documentation on your end as the buyer is correct.
I guess one other thing that came to mind when we were talking about how some businesses don't always have great documents, and so it makes it difficult for the E2. If the let's say the tax returns aren't the greatest, or there's a business where there's a lot of cash and it's not reflected in the documents, it doesn't always mean that this is a no-go for an E2. And sometimes people will also find a business that they're interested in that really is kind of a marginal business if they were to walk into it and just kind of run it the same way it's being run. But it doesn't mean that it won't work for an E2 if they have maybe extra capital to put into the business and a business plan to show how they're going to turn it around.
Yeah, that
I think that too.
I know that, and there are attorneys and consultants who have planted, and brokers who have planted this. You have to have 2 employees. You have to these, and my first question to every buyer is, okay, what do you think and who has told you what, and what chat room have you been in? And if they've been told that, it's like, that's not true.
Sure. No, it makes for an easy visa case, where we've got clean books and already employees, but it's doable. It's doable with a shaky business that has potential.
Right. And the buyers tend to really worry on the visa. And I'm like, your biggest challenge on the visa is hiring the right attorney. That's it. If you hire the right attorney, they're going to tell you whether it's going to fly or not fly. And if it's marginal, what we got to do to fix it. And then having the right team to find the business and getting the CPA in line and, executing. But it is not this rote mechanical, hey, 2 business, copy of a lease, and I hear that over and over. I still hear it. I heard it more 5 years ago, but I'm like, that's just not the case.
Right.
It's just, patently wrong. And I can show you case after case after case where, we've done it with less, so that's a good point. And I literally, the gentleman who we talked about earlier, who made an appointment with you, that was planted in his head. And I'm like, no, those are incorrect.
Yeah, might be seeing some more of those, creative packages too. If, when the inventory is low and people may say, ooh, well, okay, maybe I'm going to spend a little less on a business that's not quite turnkey.
Yeah,
But I will
like,
take this
like
and
there's one we're looking at where the business has been bought and sold 3 times.
okay.
And they're like, well, we don't have 3 years tax returns. Well, the broker probably does. Like in that case, I've got all 8 years tax returns
Okay.
going back to the beginning. And you did the case. I said, so we have the documentation to kind of put it together and make that, to execute against that. So it's not an either or kind of Venn diagram. We're not in a computer system that says XYZ. So all right. Well, thank you for doing this.
Okay,
Friday.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yes, I hope it's going to be a great new year for everybody.
Yeah, I hope. How do people get a hold of you?
Best way to get a hold of me is email, and my email is lisa@lisavisa.com, or you can go to my website, which is lisavisa.com. And there's a link there for sending an email as well. And then we usually try to, feel free to email me. And then we usually try to set up a consultation, and often do it by Zoom or Skype or phone. And we spend an hour to really kind of go through, the goals and history and what people want to do and what it's going to take and the costs and all of that stuff.
Right. And remind couples that they need to be married or they're submitting 2 packages. One of your referrals, I had to break that news to the other.
I had that yesterday, actually,
Yeah.
A common law spouse. And I said, well, if you both want to come in on this visa and one would like to have a work card, that's actually something too I probably should mention real quick. Anyway, they're going to get married now. So yeah, I inadvertently encouraged a few marriares.
Yeah, I have too. And I actually volunteered. I'm a notary. So I said, in Florida.
Oh, there you go.
I could do it in the office if you'd like. Yeah.
A real quick side note, immigration, in the past, where an E-2 visa holder has come in as a spouse can get a work card. And with that work card, they can work freely in the US. The work card backlog is tremendous. It's taking 9-10 months to get those work cards. Same thing with renewals. It's awful. So there was a lawsuit filed against immigration for the E-2 visa holder spouses, and then spouses of H and L visa holders. Immigration said now the new policy is that E-2 spouses are authorized to work incident to status, which basically means as part of being an E-2 spouse, you have work authorization without the need to get that work card anymore. So that's huge and it's great, but it's got to be implemented now. So in practical terms, it's still hard for employers to hire somebody who's an E-2 spouse without that. So that's going to be implemented and trickling down. For now, I think it's better just to try to have that work card until immigration and Customs and Border Protection they're going to have to annotate differently now who is an E-2 spouse versus an E-2 child.
Or when you walk into a job interview, bring a copy of the statute.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that's good news for the spouses.
Yeah, that's huge, because I was listening to that yesterday on a conference call with somebody. They were talking how long it took. One of your clients was talking about how long it took to get the work card.
Yeah, forever.
All right, good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Happy Friday.